In fact, what I mean is, in fact, the violence committed by the actors are not considered to be valid. They go unpunished. For instance, second or third marriages or children's sexual exploitation, abuse, child abuse, although they are banned, they are not punished. And also because of this lack of action, the administrators themselves have discrimination, commit discrimination. In fact, when we talk about Syrians, we're not talking about a single group that it goes for LGBTI and female refugees. They're not a homogeneous group. Kurdish Syrian refugees and Arabic Syrian refugees are hugely different. There are major differences between these two. And in fact, due to the discrimination that they had been facing for decades in Syria, they came here and they were carrying the load of that years of discrimination. And here, being a Kurdish Syrian refugee has a different meaning. I also had discussions with LGBTI refugees on the ground. There are non-Muslim LGBT refugees and there are Muslim believers. There are trans refugees, and there are those who are engaged in sex work. There are differences between all these groups, but what they've all explained was as follows. When I talked to Syrian trans refugees too, they said that, and also when I talked to Sunnite Arabic refugee female, the same. In fact, they said that being Syrian was the major cause, the most dominant cause for discrimination that they face among all these identities. So they hid their Syrian identity as a result, some of them. If I have more time, I would like to add the following. When we carried out the field research, and also later in our discussions with NGOs here, from here, we see the following. In fact, in Turkey,
tartışabilme imkanını yitirmiş olan bir
there is a group that has faced decades of discrimination, and especially in the last 5 to 6 years, due to the authoritarian regime, that they could not speak up regarding their own problems. So there's already a lot of pressure here on the ground. And especially when it comes to discrimination and physical or acts that amount to physical violence, one reason is impoverishment in Turkey and economic factors, we were told. For example, attacks to businesses owned by Syrians. And in fact, the extent to which economic factors are at play in terms of attacks against women and LGBT, we could discuss that, but from my research outside Istanbul, I see that in areas where second marriages are widespread, there's little opportunity to come together with Syrian refugees, female refugees. And I define myself as a feminist as well. So I believe that there's a need for us as feminists to think what type of language we will construct. And the article you gave an example of shows this as well. We need to see how serious the situation is on the ground. The Turkish Statistic Group calls a group Syrian brides in Turkey. In fact, in our research as well, I defined them as unpaid domestic workers and sex workers, and majority, an important proportion are child, and it's a crime under the Turkish Penal Code. In fact, we need to think about how we will cooperate with LGBTI community. In fact, we have an agreement regarding the language we will use, but when it comes to solidarity, what will be our language? Which language discourse we will be using? And when it comes to second marriages, what will be the approach we will adopt? Just very concretely, according to the legislation in Turkey, but in Syria, a man could have more than one wife, but in Turkey, Turkey grants residence permits to only one of the wives of a Syrian man who could have more than one wife. In fact, I leave this as a question mark because this is difficult in terms of feminist solidarity, in terms of which approach we will adopt. When it comes to discrimination and hate speech, we should add the following. In fact, Turkey is an active subject in the war in Syria. Our NGO colleagues in our discussions told the following. When Turkey was conducting cross-border operations, especially when there were soldiers lost in the Turkish army, the attacks against Syrians intensified. In fact, on the border areas, we heard that the Syrians could not leave their homes for days. I'll try to explain with the following words. In terms of hate speech and discrimination, we need to discuss what are the challenges in the Turkish society. But there's a legal regime that intensifies this, encourages this, and guides this. And Syrians come from a source country, and Turkey, the Turkish state, is a direct party to the conflict in their home country. I hope I haven't exceeded my time, but we should take that into consideration. Thank you very much.
We have time. Thank you very much for your comments. Mert, what would you like to say? How do you see the situation from your perspective? First of all, I would like to thank Granting Foundation as well for their invitation. I would like to thank all the organizers for preparing this event. My perspective will be based on my own research. In 2017, I started my PhD research, and it is still ongoing. Actually, it was supposed to be finished by now, but in March, it was supposed to be finished. I came to Turkey on the 2nd of March, and then I wasn't able to leave Turkey because of COVID-19. Therefore, the research is still ongoing. We all know that Turkey changes all the time. From a legal perspective, in terms of bureaucratics, Turkey changes all the time. Therefore, there is no end to observing. There is no end to looking into the field. This is why this research is still ongoing. We are in 2020 now. I had some interviews in the beginning of this month, so we can say that since now, it has taken 21 months. this field work. And in this field work, I talked to refugees coming from Syria and Iran. They are the majority, but I also saw some refugees coming from Zimbabwe, for example, coming from Egypt, coming from Pakistan. I also had interviewees from those countries. This is my perspective, first of all. Secondly, Ms. Zeynep talked about the legal framework very well. I would like to elaborate on that. Deportation, being deportable. I would like to talk about that concept specifically. When it comes to hate speech and discrimination, being deportable is one of the conducive mechanisms for that. Being deportable means that you could be deported any moment from a country, living with that fear. Because of that fear, there are two effects that come forward. The first one is that because of that fear, because of that feeling, when you are exposed to something, a certain type of discrimination, you do not try to access to a legal mechanism. You do not try to go to the police. Here is the most important thing here. You could be a refugee with papers or no papers. This doesn't matter. You don't go to the police, because when you go to the police, you are not sure whether the police will be on your side or not. Are you going to go to the court, or are you going to be deported after you go to the court? So they hesitate. The second one is the reality of all these. There are bureaucratic structures, and actually you are faced with a real threat of being deported when you get into such bureaucratic mechanisms. So the threat is real. Being deportable, living with that threat, is very important actually. In daily life, trans women or LGBTI individuals, they are faced with discrimination, and because of ethnicity, because of being a refugee, this is multiplied. In Turkey, trans women, they are subjected to discrimination on İstiklal Avenue in Tarlabaşı. The police take advantage of certain regulations. This is why they exercise violence against trans women. And the same thing goes for asylum seeker women and refugee women as well. But when deportation issue steps in, this goes beyond a mere disadvantage. This paves the way for all sorts of discrimination, actually. I would like to give you an example. In 2018, I went to the field and I observed something. By the way, I shouldn't forget, my field study happened in 4 different provinces: Istanbul, Ankara, Eskişehir, and Yalova. The reason why I chose Eskişehir and Yalova is that there is a large LGBTI refugee community in Eskişehir. And as you know, in Istanbul and in Ankara, there are many NGOs working with refugees. There's a high concentration of that in those 2 provinces. So when I was in Istanbul for my field work, I talked to the members and managers of trans guest house. After it was opened up, it was enlarged in a way to cover refugee trans individuals as well. They provided accommodation for LGBTI individuals in Istanbul. One of the 2 places, there was another guest house opened up by Hamam Project. So in the first interview with them, the residents of the guest house and the manager of the guest house, they shared with me an incident they had 2 weeks before that. 2 Syrian trans women were taken under custody by the police because they were suspected of being sex workers. They reached out to the guest house. A Syrian homosexual person went to the police station to act as translators, but then he was taken under custody because he was suspected of being a facilitator for them. So he was taken under custody as well. And then all of these 3 people were sent to a deportation center. The guest house did chase the issue, and they did move the other NGOs as well. So this deportation process stopped after a certain point, but really for 1 week, they exerted every effort to get out of that situation. Here, the most important thing is sexuality, actually, because according to certain articles of the Turkish law, those refugees or asylum seekers that act as sex workers, their process of getting deported must be could be accelerated. So they suffered this, but then with an act of solidarity, this process was stopped. This adds many different layers. I mean, deportation adds many different layers to this phenomenon of discrimination. At this point, I also would like to add that there is a systemic problem in Turkey. This was a manifestation of this systemic problem. LGBTI refugees, they live with their neighbors, they share the same neighborhood, they share the same city. And actually, those people with whom they share the same city are the main perpetrators of discrimination in Yalova and in Eskişehir, for example. There is a high concentration of refugees in those cities, and we observe this in those cities. Here is the reason why. For long years, they have received high numbers of LGBTI refugees in those provinces, and they start to think that all of those refugees coming from Syria or Iran, they're all LGBTI. And this is a misunderstanding, a misconception that spread in those provinces, especially in Eskişehir. This happens quite frequently. So they assume that whoever comes from Iran, as soon as they see their passport, they see their documents, when they see that they come from Iran, they do not want to help them out. Of course, they are discriminatory against the fact that they are from Iran or Syria, but also, I mean, I'm not going to use that word, but they say, you are gay, you are transsexual, this is why I'm not going to help you. Actually, this is quite an interesting combination. On one hand, we have homophobia, transphobia. On the other hand, we have an interesting sort of Orientalism and, of course, nationalism. It is a combination of all these. And when it reflects in discourse, it becomes like this. There is no LGBTI, I quote, in Turkey. They come from the East. As they allow refugees come to Turkey, such structures are able to penetrate into Turkey. This is the discourse that we see more and more, unfortunately. I'm talking about these 2 cities at the very least. And finally, I would like to talk about the discrimination process after the pandemic. I am collecting the data as yet, so I am not able to present you with systemic findings, but here is what I see the most. Legal status affects the discrimination practices. First of all, when you go to a city as an asylum seeker, what you have to do is to get registered with a migrant's office. If you do not do that, then you cannot benefit from the rights that you're supposed to have. I mean, it could be anything, right to health or other rights. Also, I must add, in 2018, a new health implementation was started for refugees. Before 2018, they had their right to health. It was ready, the system was ready for them. But after 2018, you need to go to a hospital, you need to get a report saying that you are really ill. Then you need to go to that migrant administration to get that report approved, and then you can benefit from health services. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they suffered from this. This was one of the most important discrimination practice. Here is another tragedy that I observed. I recently talked to an interviewee. That person did not have a registry documents because the process is going really slowly. Those people who came in 2018, 2019 are still not registered in certain provinces. So this person was not able to get registration, so he did not have any foreigner identity number. This is why he was not able to get a HES code, and he was not able to go to the migration administration, so he was not able to benefit from the health services. So this is the vicious cycle that we have because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I talked to people and I observed that there is this new practice of discrimination, but this is not being very much talked about at the moment. So I wanted to note this. Yes, this COVID-19 pandemic requires a panel of its own. The fragility that increases along with this COVID-19 pandemic. If you remember, we asked the question of discrimination, multi-layered discrimination, and how it's experienced by refugees. Zeynep talked about the legal regulations, how it acts as a source sometimes, and Mert talked about deportation and how the phenomenon of deportation prevents refugees from benefiting from their rights. And Zeynep also said that Turkey, being an active subject in war, deepens discrimination. I would like to ask for a clarification from Zeynep. Actually, someone asks her. You said that the first spouse gets a residence permit. Could you please elaborate on that? Are you talking about those who are trying to get a nationality? Could you please elaborate on that? Excuse me, I didn't understand. Understand that you wanted me to respond right away. Okay. Just a clarification. Well, in fact, when we take a look at regulations in Turkey, as polygamy is not allowed, in order to get a residence permit, the process is different. They can be here under temporary protection, and also in a broader sense, this is not only true for Syrians, we have a legislation on foreigners and international protection. If under that scope we are talking about more than one marriages, which we need to, I mean, it's the husband that decides on who can benefit from the legal status, but all children can have the right of staying in Turkey. Actually, this is a broader regulation. This does not only concern Syrians. So polygamy is not allowed in Turkey. In quote, this protects women's rights. We can consider it that way. But when it is implemented categorically, actually, from a legal point of view, for women who are a second wife or a third wife, this implementation punishes them. I am not only talking about this within the scope of people under temporary protection. I am talking about this in relation with the broader legislation with whom, I mean, with the people whom it concerns. Mert, I have a questions for you as well, but if you like, we can set aside them for now and then we can come back to them during the Q&A sessions because these are not clarifications, actually, these are going to take more time. You already started talking about solidarity, and our second question is on solidarity. The women movement and the LGBTI movement, how are they related to refugees? Are they in contact with refugees? What kind of problems are there? Zeynep said that when it comes to second marriages, solidarity between women is needed, she said. How can we have it, she asked us. Maybe we can answer that question now. And Mert talk to us about solidarity networks in Istanbul. How about Eskişehir, Yalova? How about other provinces other than Istanbul? What is the situation of solidarity networks in other provinces? What kind of differences do you observe? So first of all, I will give the floor to Zeynep.
Thank you. I'll talk about women's movement and feminist movements, and I'll have two hats here. As a migrant woman living in Germany, I stand on the one side of this solidarity. I would like to say the following. In your question, you were talking about the LGBTI movement, and you were saying that it was more connected, whereas this wasn't the case for women's movement. When I started to work in 2013 on the ground, the LGBTI movement was not connected either. In fact, this comes with effort, and this is a process. In fact, in order to reach the Syrian refugees that I would be having interviews with on the ground, Mert talked about the trans guest house and the groups, LGBTI groups I was connected with, in touch with, and I saw that they were not connected among themselves. I'm in the women's movement. I try to be part of the women's movement as much as possible, and this will be a little bit of self-criticism too. As women's movement in Turkey, I think we did not pass the test successfully. I'm not there now, but I think it seems to me that we are still not so successful. I think we should look at the reasons why, because this is an outcome and it's not a random outcome. As I mentioned in my example, for second marriages, for instance, think about Antakya. And think about the women in host community. I saw that when I went there, I saw that there was a significant resistance, but this doesn't explain the following. because even among feminists that are more organized in the middle and higher socioeconomic levels, our classes, there is even a resistance. Even in cases of violence or aggression, when we say that, when we report the following, Syrian women attacked, I unfortunately saw that the reaction was not the same. Maybe the reason is as follows. Perhaps our movement, this movement, does not know how we will create these mechanisms. I don't know, but I believe that there must be some structural reasons behind. Unfortunately, perhaps we are still focused on our region, our country, in our moment. This is the type of moment or area of action we are used to. We should change that. Of course, there may be more pessimistic interpretations. I do not want to make them. In fact, those structural barriers are even harder to overcome, so I don't want to focus on them, even think about them. In fact, earlier we talked about discrimination being the source, being the starting point. So these are the examples. In fact, in any country in the world, when it comes to solidarity with refugees and women, we don't see a bright picture without any problems. This is the case for Germany too. And I can say that in Germany, women's movement is not strong like Turkey. I miss women's feminist movement in Turkey a lot. It is very weak here. So that's one of the problems I see here. In fact, migrants and refugee women who call themselves refugees or LGBTI call themselves feminists cannot find themselves, cannot find place for themselves in this moment here in Germany. And in fact, women in the broader sense we organize here marches for March the 8th and November 25th, separately from the German women's movement. In fact, there is a major difference in how we approach our struggle. In fact, in this movement of migrants and refugees, there are Turks, Brazilians, Italians, Somalian women as well. In fact, what brings us together is displacement and migration, immigration. We are also different in terms of class as well. That is why I believe this is a broad problem, but it's an extremely serious problem, and it's a critical issue in terms of feminism, in terms of the future of feminism itself. The future of the feminist movement, I think we should seriously consider it. And secondly, we could talk about whether solidarity in Turkey is prevented, but Syrian refugee women and all migrants, migrant women, female migrants in Turkey, around the world, are groups whose labor is exploited. Therefore, the extent to which we can speak up in this issue of labor, how do we respond to this issue of exploitation of women's labor in this labor discourse That's an important area as well. We may have different ideas, but I think this is one area that disrupts our solidarity. That goes for the entire world. In fact, as international organizations put it as well, refugees participate intensely in the labor market, and they work in hidden sectors, and they are subject to incredible, very significant exploitation of their labor. This goes for many areas, and there were women working as sex workers. There were women working in cleaners, as cleaners, working as those working as clerk in a school, but they were all subject to tremendous, significant exploitation of labor. Therefore, in addition to migrants, also for women in Turkey, how could we form a discourse? What actions did we come up with in terms of gender equality? In fact, this is a criticism addressed to the feminist movement around the world as well. We focused on violence, perhaps, inevitably. However, we should also pay attention to this issue of labor, and also many migrants and refugees, women migrants and refugees, they also work as domestic workers. I'm not focusing on Syrians only. Many employers are women. Therefore, I include myself in this group who have challenges. We should think about each and every challenge and how to overcome them. We should work together, think together with immigrants, female immigrants. In fact, in terms of how difficult it is to come together, we need to think about which platforms we will use, concretely think about which platforms we will use to come together. The way we come together, we organize ourselves is different than the way Syrian women organize themselves. I saw that in my research. And when I came here and looked at how the feminist movement acts here in Germany or comes together here in Germany, I see that there are differences, major differences. And Korean sisters, whom we see on our marches, they have a different form of assembly as well. So if we don't take into account these differences in thinking about how we will come together, how we will act in solidarity, we may end up with an illusion. The illusion that we speak up for them. Even if we have good intentions and we want to say something right for them, it's very hard to reach somewhere, achieve anything with this approach. I'm telling this because as a displaced and immigrant, female immigrant, as a migrant woman, in fact, I'm seeing that I'm being interviewed as a forcefully displaced woman. And when I see the outcomes, it's a big disappointment in terms of the gaps in how my words are interpreted. As a jurist, in fact, I can't tolerate that. And I'm trying to have some research here with my own efforts, like ethnography, because I don't think my voice is being heard. And when I'm having discussions with Syrian women, they probably thought the same. We can't make our voices heard. So I am trying to research myself, have researched myself and other women who were displaced at the same time as I was from Turkey. The same goes for the women movement as well. We have organizations that we are members of, but there are limitations in terms of class. As you know, this is the case for women's movement. Even ethnically, our contacts with the Kurdish women movement was late and limited, and it's disrupted now. Also, women's movements, religious movements still. And there are shadow reports under CEDAW, but Turkey still can't present them. These are, of course, severe problems, but we should think about them. And I include that, and I address self-criticism too. I include myself here. Just like what we're going through here in Germany, when we ask migrant women or LGBTI, they mostly say that they want to have their own organizations. This could be one way. In fact, contacts could be established between organizations. In fact, this is a deeper problem than how solidarity will be established between Syrian migrants and the women's movement. There are many problems. I believe the Turkish women's movement is very strong. Therefore, I believe in it and the possibility. Thank you very much, Zeynep. In fact, the different types of organizations, action, and resistance could be discussed later. And there are different ways in which Syrian refugee women organize. I can think about a few, but they lack access to the Turkey's women's movements. We could see how we could construct solidarity between the two. Mert, you could add your comments regarding women's movements, and you could also add your comments regarding the LGBTI movement, and is their track record better than the women's movement in Turkey? This is a very good question. And also a very difficult one. In order to respond to your question, we should ask another question. Who are the parties that are centered on women and produce politics? There are those who place women within a heteropatriarchal framework and reproduce those power relations. For example, Kadem. Kadem has a lot of work with Syrian women. And also those free from heteropatriarchal relations and those who advocate for women's rights. There are NGOs. They have a lot of work with refugees, such as Mor Çatı, Kadının İnsan Hakları Çözümleri Derneği. In fact, the question here is how were women approached? As what type of subject? And we should ask this question. And we should ask whether assistance was provided based on advocacy promoting women's rights, or were they centered on access to certain services? Was it an understanding that remained limited to services? Or was there any discourse that undermined women's place in society? We should ask all these questions and clarify. We should also ask the following. In fact, based on my research and my experiences as an activist, in fact, we should need to ask questions regarding women's movements and LGBTI movements. There's a feminist queer movement, for example. Based on my field experience, I think the best example is Kadam, who has a lot of work with trans refugees under projects. In fact, when I started to work in the field in 2017, I started with a great field research. KADAV has more than, I'm not clear about the figures, but has called on more than 30 organizations and told them that we're all trying to do something about women and LGBTI refugees, although this is our, with independently, or this is not entirely related to whether it's our area. We should come together and think about how we can create together, produce together, and what we could do together. They convened a meeting and more than 30 organizations attended, not only associations. There were representatives from international organizations as well. Seeing the discussion there was, at least for me, critical. In fact, we know that discrimination is multi-layered. We discussed that, and Zeynep talked about, Professor Zeynep talked about labor exploitation, which is a significant part of this. Unfortunately, we're not in a situation where we could tackle all these separately. In fact, all this should be handled together, and we should bridge different aspects. And more importantly, we should support self-association organization for LGBTI and women refugees. And we should tie this relate this to labor exploitation. In fact, they try to make livelihood, but they can't not earn enough. Although they work 12 hours, 14 hours a day, they get paid 50 TL. A Syrian person who makes this kind of income with this type of work cannot be realistically expected to organize. If they work 6 days a week, 12 hours per day, they wouldn't have energy left to be activists or to carry out advocacy work. In fact, labor exploitation is at the center of all these problems. Of course, we should talk about the different layers of labor exploitation. For instance, let's say that you've been working for 6 months in a business, and at the end of this period, your business owner finds out, your employer finds out that you're gay or lesbian. They lay you off, and because of this possibility of deportation, you may not even be paid. If you think about all these different layers, in fact, as Professor Zeynep said, we should try to form bridges and try to see all this from different perspectives. On the brighter side, because I've been pessimistic or talked about the negative aspects so far, there are well-organized groups in certain locations. For example, Istanbul, Tea and Talk group was there. We had the opportunity to have interviews with them, so I witnessed their work and got some impressions. In fact, this is a very small, this started out with a group of 3-4 Syrians, and they grew. In 2018, when I talked to them, they had reached 50 people. In fact, they had members from not only Syrian groups, but also other Arabic-speaking groups. They met every Sunday, and they held discussions and also other activities in a format they wished to have. We could talk about the following bridge. Assam and Spot in Istanbul, and other such organizations opened spaces for Tea and Talk to come together. It is very important to open venues to these people and to leave the content entirely to them. In fact, this is how you would support, to some extent, self-organization. This is one of the most significant types of support, but also within the movement, we should look at themselves as well, within the LGBTI community as well. Of course, there are many venues we come together and discuss, but we should also discuss that discrimination exists even in those spaces. I think, especially in 2016, on the Pride Week, during the activities, there is an incidence. In fact, a discourse, the following discourse was used. We should save the Turkish LGBTI community, to criticize the Syrian LGBTI community. In fact, there were such examples, so we should look at our own community as well. I should also add the following. In fact, this is part of my academic activism. The history of LGBTI refugees in Turkey and the organizations that are in touch with them do not date back to 2011. They have a longer history. In fact, what I've observed in my research is the following. In fact, till the beginning of 1990s, the LGBTI community that arrived in Turkey as refugees, there were such individuals, and also beginning of 2000s, there were people. And KOSYL and Lambda Istanbul, two major organizations within the LGBTI community, have started to support LGBTI refugees after the 2000s. They start with language courses, and they started to work with the UNHCR as well. Lambda Istanbul carries this out, but Lambda Istanbul is smaller now, but they had these activities. So I just wanted to add these points regarding how long the history of LGBTI refugees in Turkey is, and interaction, also the history of the interaction between the associations and the LGBTI community refugees.
Thank you very much. I am checking our time limits, and I would like to ask you to write your questions in the chat box. We are going to try to answer them as best as we can. You talked about solidarity. It would be very good if you were able to discuss this with our participants, because I think that we have activists amongst us. We can listen to their experiences, how they overlap or how they contradict with what you said. Okay. Let's move on to our third question. Actually, this is very much related to self-organization. Syrian women and LGBTI individuals, they are subjected to discrimination, and what kind of strategies do they develop based on your observations? I'm not only talking about Syrians, all refugees, what kind of strategies they develop, just like self-organizations, what others are there? Have you observed any other strategies on their part? Zeynep, I would like to give the floor to you first as well. Strategies against discrimination. What I saw in the field is that they use various strategies. Just to give you an example, some women refugees, they prefer not to go far away from where they live. they live in a very limited space because they're worried, they're concerned. Because they do not know how to read or write in their own mother tongue either. When they go to a grocery shop, they are mocked. Someone said that actually. They said, she said she was made fun of, she wasn't able to speak Turkish. This is why they limit their living space. Their environments are already too crowded. The conditions are already too difficult. So limiting that space is quite destructive for women. I'm sure that you know, I'm sure that you're aware. So this shutting down strategy was used a lot by those women. Another thing, they were trying to reach into certain codes that existed in Turkey, that exist in Turkey. And by reading into those codes, they were trying to survive without being insulted, without being attacked in the city. For example, let me give you an example. As Mert said, guest houses, they save lives actually. I would like to greet and salute each and every person that works there. A trans woman, a sex worker, that went to that one of those houses, but that refugee was quite religious, Muslim and religious. She was wearing a hijab based on her religious belief. She said that she didn't wear it all the time in Syria, but in Turkey, as a trans woman, that hijab provided her with a living space. Actually, when she wore that, she felt safer. As you know, security forces in Turkey, they are most of the time perpetrators of violence. So as a trans sex worker, she observed that the police treated her better when she wore that. But in another part of the city, this created another sort of discrimination. There was another trans sex worker. So with a friend of hers, she had rented an apartment in Kurtuluş, but in that neighborhood, she didn't feel safe as someone who wore hijab. And her friend, actually, they shared an apartment. They had gotten out of a guest house together and they had rented an apartment. And that friend, even though she didn't wear hijab, she was religious. And she had to warn her friend, if you do not put off that hijab, you cannot live in this apartment because our neighbors here, they see a woman in a hijab as a threat. I hope I was clear. In one part of the city, hijab is a strategic factor that makes you feel safe, but in another part of the city, not even 1 hour far from that place, it puts you in threat. Back at that time, there were bombs going off. So when you wore a hijab, they thought that under your clothes, you were hiding a bomb. So in Turkey, context changes all the time. You need to follow the context and you need to come up with a strategy. That's what they go through. Most of them, they try to hide that they're Syrians. Unless they have to show their identity, they don't tell they're Syrians. Some of them said they were from Lebanon. If they were able to speak English, they spoke English as best as they can so that they were able to hide that they were Syrians. Being a Syrian was the worst thing for them, actually. For example, a sex worker from Lebanon, yes, she is faced with discrimination as well, but if you're Syrian, it's even worse. From a women perspective,
dayanışmayla
There is solidarity through informal networks. This is how they're trying to survive.
Çok fazla henüz bizim konuştuğumuz dönemde şeylerle bir bağlantıları yoktu. Herhangi bir
They were not very much connected with any NGO when I talked to them.
strateji henüz geliştirmemişlerdi.
They had not
Hatta
developed
ben
any strategy in
burada
that direction.
bazı görüşmecilerimle aynı zamanda dost olmuştum.
I actually became friends with some of my interviewees, and there was a march on the 8th of March actually for Women's Day. Back then, police violence was not this severe, but still they hesitated to participate in that march, in that parade, even though I was someone that they trusted. They try not to be seen, they try not to be noticed actually, as best as they can. I could maybe add the following. Just like Mert said, being deportable is an issue. I am a migrant myself in this country. In order for you to have a motivation to survive, even for that, there are some preconditions. You need to have certain things to have that motivation. Actually, deporting Syrian refugees, being able to deport them is a governing strategy for the state, for the Turkish state. This fear is being supported on purpose. When we take a look at in the field in general, on one hand, we have this integration discourse. They receive enormous amounts of money from the European Union. And an important part of it goes to projects, but on the other hand, there is this fear of deportation that is pumped. They say integration, and I believe that that term is problematic, but this is the official discourse. On one hand, they use this money for integration, but on the other hand, when you look at NGOs, they work with Syrian refugees, and 4 or 5 of them, they are sent to deportation centers, or the operations in Syria, they are intensified and they can't even go out of home, so they cannot really be integrated. But I believe that this is a conscious policy. They do it on purpose. They use this fear. You are legally prevented from getting a permanent status. The temporary protection regulation, when you look at it, you can see that there is no way at all that they can receive a permanent residence. For example, if I put myself in their shoes, if here I didn't have any means of getting permanent residence, let me use their term, how can I be integrated to this society? There is no way. Therefore, they are trying to protect themselves from violence, from that destructive violence, themselves and their families. This is the strategy that they adopt. Other than that, let me say that in the interviews that I carried out, back then I wasn't a migrant, by the way, but when I interviewed them, I was impressed by their power. I admired their power, actually. They talked about their daily experiences. Yes, I have a child as well, and I was to some extent able to empathize with them, but there was this unbelievable power, both emotionally and physically. And the emotional effort that they exert, I admired them. I am a migrant myself, an immigrant myself in Germany. I am displaced myself. So I derived power from their own power. For example, I remember talking to a woman. She was coming from an Alawite family. As they were seen as as al-Assad in Turkey, they were discriminated against a lot. I mean, it was even very difficult to convince her for the interview. So this mother had children. She also had a 7 or 8-year-old daughter. So she sent all her children to work on the streets, even before the sun goes up. There was no guarantee that they would be able to return in the evening without being subjected to violence or return at all. There was no protection, there was no guarantee. But despite this fact, she was able to powerfully survive. So women's emotional efforts, immigrant women's emotional efforts, their resistance, I believe this has so much to teach Turkish women. I personally learned a lot from them, so I think that this was very important. Another issue for LGBTI members, a resistance strategy could be as follows. There were certain difficulties experienced by sex workers. There were sex workers coming from Syria that were already sex workers in Syria, or there were those who started doing that in Turkey. Their conduct code is very different than ours in Turkey. Their clientele is quite different. So there were some that were very concerned about this because they were not able to define this new environment in their heads. The only place they could stay was this trans guest house. I don't even know if that is still functional. Maybe you could tell me. In that guest house, there were Turkish trans individuals, and their age was older actually. So the Syrian refugees that stayed there, they had to continue working as sex workers, and they were faced with certain difficulties, certain tensions because of that, and they had to develop certain strategies against that. Because you had to work, and then when you were finished, you had to go back to the guest house. But at what time were you supposed to get back in order to avoid tensions? I mean, I remember that I worked really hard on how to solve that. How can you stay in the guest house and work as a sex worker in the meantime? So their strategies are quite comprehensive and quite creative, I can say. Thank you very much for this very detailed answer, Zeynep. As we have limited time, I am going to turn right away to Mert. How about your observations, Mert? Actually, there are two dimensions to this. First of all, they develop personal strategies, and secondly, they develop strategies in solidarity. When we take a look at their personal strategies, there are various elements, and of course, the most important one is ethnic origin. Zeynep mentioned this in detail. She talked to us about how it's hidden, how it's done in secret, but I would like to take another approach. I had an interviewee and a person from Azerbaijan and Iran. She was one of my main interviewees, so I talked with them a lot, with her a lot. She told me that when she was contacted by the police, she only spoke Turkish, and she showed her passport saying that I am actually Turkish, I had to flee from my country. So she wanted to eliminate that threat of being deported. She had created a mechanism for herself. There are many others. For instance, I don't know how it's said in Turkish, it's passing in English. They try to pass, they try to hide their gender identity, they act as a heterosexual individual. They try to hide that they are transsexuals, especially in working environments. This was one of the individual strategies that I saw the most. But these individual strategies have some destructive effects that prevent them from getting together. This is something that I saw a lot in Yalova, because if you know Yalova, you would know this. There is one coastal avenue, and there are many restaurants on that avenue. There is a lot of turnover, many people that eat there, and it's all on the same avenue. And if you want to work on that avenue, you need to hide the fact that you are an LGBTI member. So this causes a division between trans people and gay or lesbians. So they stopped interacting with each other on the street, and there was this real separation that happened after a while. I would like to give you an example. This is something that I observed myself during an event. Actually, this was an event organized by trans women, and especially for them. We were eating, and there was the lover of one of the trans women that participated. So when we were having coffee, we learned that we were at the coffee shop that is right next to the person where she worked, where he worked. And a person came from that coffee shop asking him, "What are you doing here with these transsexuals? Why are you spending time with them?" So when I talked to these people in detail, I saw that there was this division, this separation between transsexuals and homosexuals. Another point that I would like to mention, as Zeynep said, because of the laws in Turkey, they know that they cannot stay in Turkey for a long time. And for a long time, it is difficult to define actually 10 years or 20 years, because already the waiting period is quite long. Sometimes they wait for 6 years to be able to go to another country. So the definition of long is quite complicated, but in the end, they know that they cannot live in Turkey permanently. And this leads into a transnational solidarity. They could go to third countries, for example, the US, Canada, France, Spain, the UK. So they interact with LGBTI refugees that have already gone to those countries. Especially in Canada, there's the system of sponsorship. There are people that can sponsor you for your asylum applications. In order to initiate that process, you need to be in contact with the LGBTI organizations there. There are some people who are in contact like that. So these kinds of contacts open a door for solidarity. Of course, I'm not romanticizing this or I'm not approving of this. I only want to show you the reality. And here I say, if we consider this as a line, on one side there is Turkey, and on the other side there are other countries, the third countries, if I may call them, and they communicate with each other. At this point, I should say that most of the LGBTI members, they flee from their families. They flee from the violence that they are faced with in their families, and sometimes they flee from the state as well. If they flee from the state, they can get the support of their family in Iran, for example, or they can get the support of the LGBTI community in Iran. Therefore, while they wait in Turkey, they form these solidarity networks that gather together three different communities. Of course, I could go into further detail, but as we have limited time, I am not going to take up much of your time.
I could continue with a follow-up question. The possibility of moving to a third country. How does this affect LGBTI's association in Turkey regarding the situations they face here? Another question is about the example you talked about in Eskişehir and Yalova, the perception that all refugees are LGBTI. And in Denizli, there's the perception that all refugees are sex workers. They talk about this perception. What would you like to say about this? The perception that all refugees, LGBTI refugees, are sex workers. What is the added burden and the challenges that brings to their lives, at least in Yalova and Denizli? Another participant talked about the accommodation mechanisms. Could you give more examples? Apart from guest houses, what are the other options that are used, that are available? Zeynep, I will read the question for you. Çağla Ünlü Türk Ulutaş asked, many Syrian and Iraqi women are surrounded with heavy patriarchal norms, and they are exploited within their own house, and many have an Islamic lifestyle. What is the first step to enable them to take to the street and speak up? I'm thinking about neighborhood work, but the Turkish women's movement has little experience, and some have dominant discourses. For example, we are saving women. Do you think that this type of neighborhood efforts can take place? Could this be a solution, an option? What are your thoughts on this? What about going outside and the pressure around that and speaking up? How could women overcome that, and how could they be supported? And another question for you is about Yazidi women in Germany and their role in feminist activism in Germany. After Yazidis reach Germany, what could they do? What can they do? Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. These are the questions I have before me. As you respond to these questions, maybe further questions will be added. Who would like to start? Zeynep, would you like to start again? Your questions are fresh. I will begin then. I'd like to begin with the order you asked regarding Çağla Ünlü Türk's question. Well, in fact, in my field work with Syrian refugees in Turkey, I witnessed and experienced the following. Based on that, I could say the following, and also as a migrant, immigrant woman. In fact, I don't think, I'm not sure if they're surrounded by more patriarchal norms than those surrounding Turkish women. And there are many similarities that I observed. In fact, when I went to the interview, I thought that even the interviews that I thought that would be few similarities between myself and them, I saw that there are many similarities. You talk about heavy patriarchal norms and exploitation within one's own house. These are similar experiences faced by women in Turkey. In terms of our struggle, I think this could help us act in solidarity and advance our cause in solidarity. I think there's a lot we can learn from Syrian women. From their resistance and how they organize themselves in their home country, in their own country. And when it comes to speaking up, I don't think, I'm not sure if they need our role as an intermediary, if they need us to act as an intermediary, because they survive so much that in any way, I thought that their words were already very strong. Maybe when you talked about neighborhood, you meant the following. Of course, us reaching their locations is important. The way we organize is not about expecting them to join come and join our associations or trade unions. Most of them lack the means to do that. But I'm talking about informal associations, and that existed. I talked to textile workers and Bağcılar's textile workshops with Syrian women work there. Many Syrian women work there. And some of them sent their children to schools where Syrian children go to, where some of the locations where Syrian women had informal networks, seeing the locations where these types of networks already exist and hearing their words could be an opportunity to learn from them as part of a perspective, perhaps. And as for Yazidi women, I don't have specific work regarding Yazidi women. Regarding the role of Yazidi women in feminist activism in Germany, I could say the following. These are my impressions. In fact, I'm based in Berlin. Regarding migrant and refugee women, there's an internationalist alliance. I'll use a popular word with a transnational feminist perspective. Korean women are working very actively in this moment. As you know, there's this group called Comfort Women who were enslaved by and exploited by the Japanese army as sex workers. They still seek justice. South Korean women's movement is working on this, and they are also working on Yazidi women. Regarding violence against women in the form of making them sex workers in conflicts. There was action that lasted a few days regarding Yazidi women. And in our declarations on March the 8th and November the 25th, that's a subject we talk about Yazidi women. But I haven't done any academic research on this very topic yet. till now. Thank you, Zeynep. Mert, if you could briefly respond so that we will end up with more participants. Maybe people are already getting zoomed out. I'd like to talk about mechanisms. As far as I know, the accommodation mechanisms. I believe the guest house is no longer working. In 2019, there were efforts to stop the closure, but I don't know how they ended. I think the other guest house is closed too. I believe that it was closed back in March 2019, at least from what I remember from the video. Of course, the mechanisms regarding their needs, particularly in Eskişehir and Yalova, comes from the solidarity. If you're Iranian, you share a house with Iranian LGBTI refugees. Till you have your own house, you rent your own house, you may not be paying rent. So that's solidarity, but it remains ethnicity, nationality-based ethnicity-based solidarity. And the only trans women in Yalova was alienated from a different country. Well, of course, she had to befriend different groups, but when she arrived, she had many difficulties. And I'm sure that's the type of stigmatization we saw in Denizli, we can see in Denizli, but in other locations in Eskişehir and Yalova, the stigmatization is based on LGBTI, not sex work. The last question is a very good question. In fact, I've just published an article on this topic, on this question. If I should talk about the system for moving to a third country, it's incredibly competitive. It's very competitive. And here is how. Third countries assign quotas to UNHCR Turkey, and there are few places, very few places. The placement rate around the world for UNHCR is only 1%. And in Turkey, in some years, we see that the figure drops to 0.8%, and some years 0.25%. So these are the already low rates. So for placement for refugees in Turkey, in terms of accessibility to the third country, it's extremely competitive. And due to the multi-layered discrimination, UNHCR may expedite refugee process for registration for LGBTI refugees in Turkey. The interviews are held by the Provincial Migration Authority, but the UNHCR could get in touch with the Provincial Migration Management Directorate to expedite the process. In fact, the LGBTI refugees in themselves act within this competition, and they are thus a critical element. And on the ground, I observed the following phenomenon. Pseudo-LGBTI, pseudo-convert refugees is another example of such phenomena. In fact, consider that, imagine that I'm a real LGBTI person. They're not expediting my process, but there are those who lie their way through this process. And people believe in them, and people believe that they are LGBTI, and they expedite their process. In fact, we should understand that there's a great, strong competition, and it talks about, it lays bare how broken the international system is, or dysfunctional this system is. In fact, people have to wait in a country where they cannot settle for 5-6 years, and they need to be very competitive, and they may have to show that they are competitive to get their rights. Of course, we can go on and on about that, but this was a very, very good question. Thank you very much. Elçin, would you like me to close, or should we have another discussion? It's up to you. Just for a little bit longer, we would wish to continue, but I think the interpreters are tired, the participants are tired too, I believe. Maybe it would be good to have a separate discussion or to dedicate time separately for another discussion. And then I would like to thank Zeynep and Mert. Regarding guest houses, a participant wrote the most recent situation regarding both guest houses. They are both closed, but there are alternative referrals. We were informed. Thank you very much for this information. Thank you for your participation and for listening to us. As you have many Zoom meetings, of course, the discussions will continue. In fact, we talked for almost 2 hours on few topics. We hope to come together to have another discussion on this subject. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you. Thank you. It's very nice to meet with you again, although remotely. I hope to come together with you once again, online or offline. Have a nice evening. Thank you, our panelists, our participants, the interpreters, and my colleagues here. Mert, would you like to say goodbye too? We would like to thank the interpreters in particular. They have interpreted us for the last 2 hours. And I'd like to thank all participants who stayed with us for the last 2 hours. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you. Have a good evening.